Hi everybody, welcome to Philosophy 1200. Today should be Wednesday, April 15th. Um, so on Monday we introduced the first batch of informal fallacies, and today we're just going to go over the rest of them. Before we get started, I want to remind you sort of what informal fallacies are. So fallacies in general are bad arguments from the perspective of logic and reasoning, as philosophers have characterized it. So fallacies are bad arguments. We have two kinds of fallacies. They're formal and then there's informal. We learned a couple formal arguments in the last unit, such as FDA and FAC. Those are fallacious. Those are bad because of their structure or their form. So regardless of what you put into a formal fallacy, everything that comes up will be bad because the reasoning doesn't fit together right. Informal fallacies, on the other hand, may be wrong for a multitude of reasons. Oftentimes, you can have an informal fallacy or an argument that commits an informal fallacy that exists within the form of a valid argument. But in those cases, we can reject the argument based on its meaning or based on the sort of premises or the conclusions that are drawn within it. So that's what makes them informal. They have nothing to do with the structure or the form of the argument. But because of that, there's a plethora of different informal fallacies out there. There's a plethora of ways of sort of cashing them out, and sometimes they're hard to spot. But I think that just goes to show why they're so important to know about, because they're really good tricks of reasoning if you want to persuade people, but they're also really good red flags that you can look for when you think you might be getting duped when you're going about the world. So that's why they're important. They're extremely applicable for real life, unlike the rest of this class, and they're sort of fun to go out and look for. So review the last lecture if you want a refresher on the first batch. We're going to do the second batch here, and that will be all the fallacies that we need to know for this course. Alright, so again, we're grouping these by these sort of categories. Plenty of different logic books will group them by different categories or not group them at all, and they might lump fallacies together or split them up into their separate parts, but this is sort of what we're going to go for. So yeah, don't be too confused if you Google these things and you might get something slightly different. That's perfectly okay. I'll be grading a lot of the fallacy stuff either with these strict definitions, or I might grade some of them by hand. So there should be a good amount of leeway in terms of how you're evaluated on your knowledge of these. So these are the fallacies of illicit presumption. The first one is accident. Accident is the opposite of a hasty generalization. So this is when someone uses some general rule and doesn't really consider the fact that there may be exceptions to that rule. So as a hasty generalization, when you take one particular instance and then you generalize it inappropriately, accident is when you take one generalization and you apply it to every single possible case, and often to sort of hilarious results. So this first example, the speed limit is 60 miles an hour. We just see an ambulance going at least 90. Therefore, the cop should pull them over. I think when we read that, we sort of see that that's absurd because of our sort of knowledge of the social rules. But what makes it absurd is that it commits this fallacy of accident. Because we all know from living in our society that ambulances are exempt from speed limits. So we should not be surprised that the cops are not going to pull them over. Anyone who does falls for this fallacy. Another great example from another logic book. My cousin's illegal drug supply was stolen last week. Luckily, the thief was caught. Therefore, the police have to return my cousin's stolen drug supply to him. Again, I think based on our knowledge of social rules, this is pretty funny. Why? Because there's no way that the police are actually going to return drugs to somebody. But this person giving this argument might think that they do, because normally when something is stolen and then found, we would hope that the police try to return that to them. Maybe not in all cases. But, if what was stolen was, illicit substances, those probably aren't going to get returned. So accident, just think about it, the opposite of the hasty generalization, and it's usually a very rigid application of a rule. All right, the next one is begging the question. Philosophers use this term very specifically. When normally in sort of colloquial language, when we talk about begging the question, we actually mean like raising the question. Maybe someone will say something interesting and then I'll respond. Well, that begs the question of this other thing that's related. That's not really what we're talking about when we mean begging the question. When we use it in philosophy class, it means a very specific thing. And begging the question is pretty much arguing in a circle. You beg the question when you assert the truth of the conclusion as one of your premises. And yeah, that's what makes it circular. If you beg the question in a proof, you can very easily see it. So I'll drop a proof here. A, then B, and then our conclusion we'll say is A. Well, this argument right here begs the question. Why? Because our conclusion is A, and we don't have to make any inferences because A already exists as one of our premises. So you beg the question when you sort of make your argument redundant, or you try to, usually restate your conclusion in a different way and try to be clever when in fact you aren't actually saying anything at all. A lot of times it comes up just because we think that we're arguing a different point than we actually are. Sometimes philosophers will debate whether an argument actually begs the question or not. There's just sort of a little bit of leeway here, but in most of our examples it'll be pretty explicit, especially in this example here. The Bible is the Word of God. The Bible says that God exists, therefore God exists. That's arguing in a circle. You would need some other justification for the Bible being the Word of God, or the Bible saying that God exists, in order to prove that God exists via this means. So yeah, that's begging the question. Just be on the lookout for someone. It usually happens when someone doesn't argue their point strong enough. So yeah, I actually I defended my master's thesis last week, and one of my advisors actually pointed out that I begged the question in one of my sections, and thankfully it wasn't integral to the paper, because if it was, I would have had to probably rewrite that section. But it just goes to show that it's easy to do this in a lot of cases, especially if we aren't good at arguing or if we think our argumentation is weak. Alright, loaded questions. These are fun. These are not allowed in courtrooms, as you might be able to find out. So these are yes or no questions that can't be answered without implying something else, because there's multiple questions in one. So, have you stopped cheating on exams? If I were to ask you that, that's a yes or no question, and whether you say yes or no, you're implying something else. So we can split up this question as to say, well, one, have you ever cheated on an exam? And then two, have you stopped cheating on exams? If I asked you this and you said yes, then that tells me that you have stopped cheating on exams, but it might imply that you at one time did. That's what makes it a loaded question. Same with, are you still an asshole? Well, that's a loaded question because it's possible that you never were an asshole. Yeah. So loaded questions, again, most lawyers are trained not to give these in a sort of trial sense because a judge will not allow that sort of thing. Other fallacies, a good lawyer might be able to slip under the radar, but these are usually pretty blatant. Alright, false choice. This one is also very common. It's also known as a false dichotomy. And this happens whenever someone presents a disjunction that doesn't actually state the facts. And I think this is useful when we think about the addition rule with our formal logic. There's always another choice, as we've seen. It's always reasonable to add another choice to an existing choice. So what someone will do when they commit this fallacy is they'll give you two choices, and if you're sort of tuned into this, you'll be keen to the fact that those two choices probably don't represent all of the possibilities. So, great example here: America, love it or leave it. That's often said by nationalists, and this is a false choice because there's clearly other options in regards to what to do about America. America, love it or leave it, or change it, or clean it up, or I don't know, have a revolution, or vote a new person in. These are all sort of options that don't fit rhetorically, but are still possibilities when it comes to reasoning. Another example here: either tuition goes up or we eliminate Greek life. You might hear an administrator say that. Well, that's clearly a false choice because there's other options. I think we've seen a lot of that with the budget crisis going on right now, where administration gives us a set of choices and we might say, well, we could cut the athletic budget, we could cut the administration budget, we could find money elsewhere. These are all sorts of possibilities that usually people in power won't give you, or at least tell you about. Another one, either you vote for the Republican or the Democrat. With the way this election is shaping up, we're going to hear a lot about this in the coming months. But technically, there's always another choice. There are third-party candidates. You could always not vote. These are choices that you could perfectly well argue for. So this choice between either a Republican or a Democrat is by itself a false choice. You could argue that maybe the Republican or the Democrat dichotomy is the most meaningful choice, but that's an entirely different argument. If somebody tells you you either vote for one or the other, that's a false choice. And then click this link in your own time. I don't know how many of you remember what 2001 was like, but yeah, George Bush gives us this choice where you're either with us, being the United States, or you're with the terrorists. Very stark contrast there. But that's, again, a false choice. I would think that there are choices in between being with the United States or being with the terrorists. But yeah, all good examples of false choice. Usually if you see a disjunction, think about the false choice. If you see an either or, think about what other possibilities there might be. Because there's a lot of benefit to, when you're having an argument, thinking about all the possibilities. All right, composition. This is an interesting one. This is when one assumes what is true of the parts is true of the whole. Usually this has to do with something's properties and how we ascribe them to things. So these are good examples. And again, most of these are pretty humorous. Atoms are invisible to the human eye. The Golden Gate Bridge is made of atoms. Therefore, the Golden Gate Bridge is invisible. So that's a perfectly valid argument, which is cool. But based on its meaning, it's completely absurd. And why? Because it commits the fallacy of compositions. Even though the Golden Gate Bridge is made of atoms, it has different properties than atoms themselves. So if you want, you can sort of delve into the metaphysics of this question, but you really don't have to. All you have to see is that it's a fallacy of composition. What's true of the parts is not necessarily true of the whole. And then this good sports analogy, the team has awful players, therefore the team is awful. Not always true. Definitely not always true. There are some times when a team has awful players and the team is actually pretty good, either through cohesion or good choicing or good coaching, sometimes a lot of luck. It's totally possible that you have a good team with awful players. To assert otherwise might be committing the fallacy of composition. All right. So division is the exact opposite of composition. So division is when you assume that what is true of the whole is true of the parts. So she's beautiful, therefore she must have a gorgeous appendix. That's blatantly absurd. I'm not sure what it would mean to have a gorgeous appendix, first of all. But I don't know, it's just silly to think about. We think of beauty as the sort of all-encompassing thing. So to think of somebody's internal organs as beautiful necessarily because that person is beautiful totally seems weird. And it's weird because it commits the fallacy of division. And then again with the sports analogy, that team is great, therefore their players must be great too. That by itself commits the fallacy of division because, again, I think we can find examples in sports where we have great teams, but those teams are made of shitty players. So yeah, it's easy to get confused between composition and division. I'll tell you right now that in any multiple choice question I give you, composition and division won't be on the same answer set. So I know they can be confusing, but I won't deliberately try to trip you up with those. Alright, and then we have these last four, and then we're totally done learning all the fallacies. These are the fallacies of linguistic emphasis. So the first one is accent, and you guys are probably fairly familiar with this, and I think it's very easy to point out. Some logic books don't even consider this a fallacy just because it's so obvious. An accent is when you use the parts of speech or like text to accentuate the parts that you want in an argument. This is pretty much how advertising works. So here's an example. Everyone will get an A in this class, and then in this small tiny print if they study hard and do the work. So I hid this antecedent here so as to like make ambiguous the fact that this is a conditional. That's committing the fallacy of accent because I'm trying to mislead you on what I'm trying to say. Here's another one. Buy this car for $0 down and 0% APR, but it's got an asterisk. The asterisk says subject to credit check. So that again makes conditional this claim right here, and does so in a sort of dubious way. And then this is not from our book, but from a different book. The way that you emphasize a sentence can be committing the fallacy of accent. It's usually the fallacy of accent comes out when you produce ambiguity, and all three of these create ambiguity. So these pretzels are making me thirsty. That implies that maybe there's other pretzels on the table. Where compare that to these pretzels are making me thirsty. Well, that implies that there might be other things on the table other than pretzels that might make you thirsty. And then the last one, these pretzels are making me thirsty. That sort of seems natural as a response to like a question or something like that. So we have the same statement 3 different times, but the meaning implied from the emphasis is totally different. That ambiguity produced is a result of the fallacy of accent. So again, when you're looking for these in problems or whatever, look for fine print, look for these little asterisks, look for, misplaced emphasis, things like that. Quoting out of context. I get a lot of journalism people in my classes, and they of all people should be familiar with this fallacy, and it's fairly simple. This is when you take a quote from somebody, but your quote implies something totally different from what they said. That's journalistic malpractice and a logical fallacy. So my example here, film critic says, this movie was captivating. It was so boring and terrible that I couldn't look away. But that same critic is quoted in a paper or something, and the journalist says, critics say the film was captivating and that they couldn't look away. Obviously, the original quote implies that the movie was bad. The second quote implies that the movie was good. That is blatant quoting out of context. So yeah, be on the lookout for that. Again, it's not super common, but yeah, it's still a fallacy nonetheless. Equivocation. So this is when you switch the meaning of a word in the middle of your argument. So in the English language, we have a number of words that have the same spelling but a different meaning. That makes them ripe for equivocation. And sometimes we may do this deliberately, other times we may do this by accident. And this is how a lot of dad jokes work. and I will present you one that one of my old teachers gave me. All right, dad joke time. So, what has 4 wheels and flies? A garbage truck. All right, I assume the laughter has calmed down by now. So that dad joke was hilarious because it equivocates the word flies. So talking about the 4 wheels and flies, your first thought is that it flies through the air or something like that. But as soon as I say the word garbage truck, now your mind goes to, oh well, they're little bugs, flies, that are on a garbage truck. So yeah, that's an example of equivocation because I switched the meaning of the two, or of the word, in the example. So here's some examples you can check out on your own. I like this one especially. I wrote my mother a letter the other day. By next week, she'll have the whole sentence. So that's equivocation because in this first sentence we think it's a handwritten letter. But the second statement implies that no, we just sent her the letter A or something like that. And then in this example we have a nice quote from Mean Girls and then the world-class philosopher Toby Keith. Alright, I believe this is the last one. Manipulative framing. This one is really hard to point out because it's always sort of ideologically loaded, and it's often difficult to divorce ourselves from ideology, if it's possible at all. But manipulative framing occurs when you frame your argument in a way such to tailor it to a specific audience. This is entirely a rhetorical move, and honestly, depending on the context, one that I wouldn't blame you for using, especially if you're in the realm of politics or any sort of persuasive enterprise. It might be to your benefit to do some manipulative framing, but for the unwashed masses, including myself, it's important to be on the lookout for this sort of thing because it's ripe for deception. So here are just some binary oppositions here that I think we see all the time in contemporary politics. So illegal immigrant versus undocumented worker. These two terms technically apply to the same groups of people, but they're framed entirely different ways. Illegal immigrant, often used by right-wing people, is meant to imply that they're not supposed to be here or that they're breaking the law. It has these sorts of implications, and I think just by using the word illegal immigrant, you might demonstrate some of your politics, and therefore might demonstrate to your audience the sort of politics you might be endorsing. Similarly, undocumented worker, more often used on the left, talks about how people just don't have papers and how they, work for a living. They're just in the nouns that they use. They're trying to carry with it an implication of a narrative. Again, that's useful in a lot of cases, but it's something that we need to be aware of. This other opposition, fetus versus unborn child, often seen in the abortion debate. Framing it as an unborn child especially is loaded because we think about children in a different way that we think about fetuses. So again, this is done entirely on purpose, and if you're on this side of the debate, I don't necessarily blame you for doing that. And then here's this one, usually happening within the Democratic Party. Affordable health care versus Medicare for all. These could be referring to the same things, but the way that you frame it might open it up to different possibilities. Affordable health care could include private health insurance. Medicare for all could too, but it's less likely to. So the way that you frame what you're talking about can have a big influence on how people hear your message. I imagine they talk about this sort of thing in communications classes and communication departments all the time. So yeah. I think especially with a fallacy like this, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should dismiss the argument based on manipulative framing, because again, I think it's so common and often so useful, but it should tip our ears to what the motivations of the speakers are and what sort of ideology they might possess, and maybe the snake oil they might be peddling. So Yeah, but that's all the fallacies. Please sort of take some time and get yourself familiar with them. I will be posting some practice exercises on Blackboard um, that will give you some sort of real world arguments, real quotes from people or characters, and it will ask you to look for a fallacy. Please try some of those. If you're still confused about some of them, please post about it in the discussion board. Don't forget you need to get those attendance points. And then if you need additional help, always Google this stuff. The internet is, they love informal fallacies. And plenty of out-of-work philosophers are trying to make a living by commenting on these. So plenty of resources available for trying to figure this stuff out. So I hope that you do that. On Friday, we'll just be spending some time doing some of the problems, and then we'll be done with fallacies, and we'll move back to proofs the next week. So that's it for me. I'll see you some other time.